So before I really get started, wanted to talk a little bit more about uh, who I am and what my background is. So like Lene said, I've been in parish ministry here at Grace Episcopal Church, which is in my Zoom background, in Amherst, Massachusetts for 4 years now, first as their curate, and then as a priest associate. And then I also have this background in writing. So creative writing was always kind of my passion way before I started thinking about ministry. And as a college student, I majored in creative writing at Susquehanna University, which is a little Lutheran liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. And there I really discovered poetry as the primary way that I was interested in writing and in reading. And at the same time, while I was there, I discovered the Episcopal Church and started thinking about ordination. And so when I was in seminary, I remember having a lot of questions about, was there really any place or connection between my kind of creative interest and what parish life as a priest would be like, especially since at the time I was working for some ecumenical worship services and doing all sorts of odd things in worship, which is a bit more difficult to do if you're using the Book of Common Prayer. So I've been really pleased that through kind of these first few years of parish ministry, I found some ways to use that passion for art and literature in parish work. But the real gift for me so far, and what I hope kind of comes through in this talk, is that it's ended up feeling natural. Like I've been very conscious of not wanting to just impose like, oh, I love poetry and I love art, so now everyone has to love poetry and art like I do, but rather finding ways to really offer those passions that connect with the needs and curiosities of people in the parish. So I used this title, Providing New Doorways, because the way that I'm thinking about art and literature in the parish, incorporating it isn't an end goal in and of itself, but it's always about what does this potentially open up in those who engage with these opportunities? How can this piece of art or literature or whatever it may be, how can it be an entryway into something, whether that's personal discussion, spiritual discussion, or just a deeper connection with a passage of scripture or with God. So with that little intro, I'm just going to dive into some of the ways that I've been doing that work in Amherst. So I would say arts and literature hasn't always been a focal point, but it's definitely something since the beginning of my time at Grace that I've worked on incorporating into various things that I do. So what that might have been, an adult ed class on poems and art that I offered in Advent my first year. Pre-COVID, I did 2 annual kind of readings featuring writers at Grace. And a lot of times I'm drawing on arts and literature in youth group or Sunday school or our youth confirmation classes. So the example I'm about to show, I believe is back in 2020 or 2021 when my youth group was all on Zoom. So we did a couple sessions that I called Stations of the Resurrection. And we looked at the different Bible passages that show the resurrected Jesus and kind of dove into the stories and discussed them. And for each story, I found different pieces of art. So this is the dinner at Emmaus where Jesus is revealed. So these are a few of the pieces. we looked at. I especially love this one on the left, called Yummaeus, and it's set, at a contemporary fast food restaurant, which I find very fascinating. And what I did with these pieces of art was usually just simply ask the kids who showed up, like, which is your favorite painting? And I found that just asking that opened up so much, because as they were describing, well, I like this one because of whatever, you would really see how they were thinking about and processing the scripture story and what to them was the most important part of that. So this is one way, just kind of in youth ministry, I've kind of used art to spur conversation. For the past 2 confirmation classes, I've used this poem by the poet Abigail Carroll called Creed, towards the beginning of the year, when we're talking about, what does it mean to believe in something, and to answer in the baptismal covenant, all these things that you believe. And I won't read the whole poem, but she kind of lists, all these things that she believes in. I believe in salt thick ancient seas, the absoluteness of blue, or I believe in the audacity of light, the patience of cedars, and the poem goes on. And so I've used that with our high schoolers, one, to just hear their reactions to the poem, but also to ask them, if you were listing out things that you believe in, what would be on that list for you? And then moving into, if you were listing things you believed in about God, what would that look like? So those are just a few examples. But I think the way I was thinking about art and literature in the church really shifted during the pandemic. And so, like a lot of churches, in 2020, we weren't worshiping together in person. And we were really trying to figure out, what are the ways that we maintain connection with one another and let people know, like, we are still here. Our community is still here. Your clergy are still here. We want to pray for you. We want to support you however we can. And credit for this idea goes to our rector, Tom Synan, who said, when the church first physically closed, I want people to hear from us every day. And we're going to send them a daily prayer email every day that would have a prayer, a poem, or something else inspirational. And then I didn't include it on the slides, but it also had kind of prayer requests specific to our community. So people's birthdays and prayers for healing. And then, any announcements or updates about just the status of church life during COVID. And so he and I both were scouring books and the internet for appropriate prayers and poems. And as time went on and we realized, oh, this is not going to be 2 weeks. We invited people from the congregation to share with us, what are prayers or poems that are meaningful to you that you might want to share with the congregation. Our parish administrator got in on the search. And I will say it was one of the most time consuming things that we did. And also, when I look back at that earlier pandemic time, I still feel like it was one of the most meaningful things that we did, even though it's such a simple concept. And there were probably some people in the congregation who were like, I don't need an email every day. But the number of people we got, who would reach out to us when they connected with a prayer or a poem, or who were wanting to share with us the poems or prayers they loved, or, the number of people who were telling us, oh, I'm printing these out and giving them to my granddaughter, or I'm forwarding this email to my niece, or whatever. It just felt like this is connecting in some way to what people are looking for. And it gave them a reason to reach out to us, I think, without having to kind of say, oh, I'm lonely or depressed in the pandemic or struggling. It gave people something to respond to. And for me, I think I started to shift how I was seeing art and literature in the congregation as like, this is not just a fun thing that I'm passionate about that can like supplement what we're doing. But instead, maybe this is actually something our community really needs, especially in the midst of, a tough time where you're craving, inspiration. And I think sometimes poetry or art can meet that in a different way than more traditional prayer language can, especially if someone's prayer life feels like it's running dry, that it provides another entryway into meaning or significance. So in 2021, in the summer, my title at Grace changed to include, it went from priest associate to priest associate and director for creative formation. And we kind of shared that with people as, this is a signal that I'm going to intentionally kind of continue this work of providing opportunities around arts and literature to help people in the development of their lives of faith. And so since summer 2021, I've really kind of been actively looking for more opportunities to do that in our congregation. And that's come to look like a lot of different things. I've done classes. I offered a class in fall 2021 on poetry and praise, where we both read poetry together and discussed it. And then we also had people do some writing of their own. And up on the screen, and I can send slides to anyone who wants to look at anything more closely later. But up on the screen is one of the writing prompts that we used. And I find every time I have people do writing prompts and then give them time to share, I always think people are going to be too nervous to share. And I think maybe that's projecting my baggage from like having been in writing workshops in academic settings. But people are usually always more willing to share than I think they will be. And I am just always very honored and astounded at like how much it opens up people to talk about their personal lives or their personal understanding of spirituality or faith. And I think it's because when you're writing or you're making a thing, it becomes a little more approachable than just asking someone, oh, can you like tell us all your thoughts on this? So in a way, it kind of leads people into a personal space without making the emphasis entirely on them, which I have found to be pretty valuable. I've also experimented with different ways of using it in worship, primarily outside of our Sunday morning, though obviously you could incorporate these things into Sundays as well. So these pictures are from a contemplative midweek service we did last Advent that I called Space for Your Spirit. And it was all about offering a variety of ways for people to engage in contemplation and meditation. And often in response to art or poetry. So each week we just had one scripture passage that we focused on, and I'd provide usually some visual art that intersected with that scripture in some way. So what's on the screen is different mountain artwork. We did a passage from Malachi that used a phrase about the mountain of the Lord. So this was kind of inviting people to think, what do you envision when you hear mountain of the Lord? And I always would have kind of a ton of poetry and quotes spread out on a bench that people could grab whatever interested them. So on the screen right now, we had a week where we talked about the gospel passage where Jesus says, "In my Father's house, there are many dwelling places." And so I found a bunch of poems and quotes that in some way had something to say about the idea of home. So I found, among other things, this poem by Ada Limon, where she talks about how she thinks about home when she's traveling, and has these beautiful lines. Then I think of you home with the dog, the field full of purple pop-ups. We're small and flawed, but I want to be who I am, going where I'm going all over again. And I really like the idea of providing these variety of art and poetry avenues into meditation in a contemplative space, because I think it gives people something to latch on to who may not be the most comfortable with silence, which I'll admit is sometimes me. I can find it difficult to, just be in the silence, but to have something to put my reflection towards, I often find helpful. But what I've really been focusing on lately have been Zoom meditations, which I offer usually over Mondays at lunch at 12:15 p.m. I try to kind of keep them 25 minutes-ish. And it started with a Lent series that I called The Cross Through Artist Eyes. And so we did a bunch of different artists, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marc Chagall, some contemporary artists. And each week we would look at a number of pieces they did of the cross or crucifixion. I'd do a brief introduction to the artist, and then I would kind of share the pieces one by one through screen share, like I'm doing right now, provide a few questions for prayer and meditation, and then I would pull up a slide or two with all the pieces together and some background music, and everyone would have usually 3 or 4 minutes to just have time on their own reflecting, and then we would talk about it after. And these are 2 pieces by the artist William H. Johnson. And this is just an example of what a question slide looked like. I won't read those questions, but every week I tended to ask, what do these images bring to mind? How do you experience them? Do they inspire a similar or different reaction than the crucifixes or crosses you might see in a church space? And so the time after all that, after everyone had the individual time, we came back together for group discussion. And again, I found that to be the most valuable part, because people, in sharing their reactions and emotions to the art, often what's coming up is how they think about the cross and how they think about Jesus. And I found particularly exploring the cross through art to be helpful, because the cross can be really tricky theologically. Like, there's a lot of complexity, I think, in understanding how do we think about the violence of the cross? How do we understand atonement? How do we understand salvation? And to approach it through art and creativity gives people a chance to connect to the cross from a different place, perhaps an emotional space rather than a thinking space, which isn't to devalue theological study or conversation, but just to say, I think art can sometimes give you a different connection point that's helpful. And so after that Lent series did well, I decided, I should just keep using this time in general format. So over the summer, every Monday, I did a poem and prayer Zoom gathering. We would read one poem. I would give like an 8-minute talk on it, and then I would bring up some questions and give people time to reflect on their own. So this is a short poem by Maggie Smith. And you can see some of the questions are things like, what's an ending you're dealing with that connects to this poem's message, and how does it connect? The poem is the author reflecting on something her daughter says about trees. So one of the questions is there anything someone in your life has said to you lately that perhaps felt meaningful in a way that they didn't intend? So we would go off, everyone would have their own time with the poem. And again, when we came back together, I was often really honored by just the personal reactions that people would share. And again, I think it helps to give people, it's something they're responding to. They get to respond to the poem and in the process bring themselves into that, but are not necessarily being told, and now is the time where you talk about yourself, or now is the time where you talk about what's going on in your spiritual life. And I recently, that was for the summer, and the past few weeks I've been doing something very similar with both poetry and visual art that speaks to the sacredness of the body in some way. So that's been called Holy Physicality, and I will probably do an Advent series over the same time of poetry. So that was a lot of examples I threw at you. And you're probably wondering, what is the takeaway? And how, if you wanted to, would you start incorporating art and literature more into your faith community? And I think a lot of it comes down to what are the small ways you can bring poetry and art into what you're already doing, whether that's in a sermon or in a Bible study, sharing a poem that relates to the passage, or if you're doing a lesson for youth or adults, is there an interesting piece of visual art that you can bring along and add to the conversation? And I think when you start doing those small things, then you get a sense of, is this connecting with my community, and is there a hunger for more of this? But before all of that, I think a lot goes back to, your own personal exposure to literature and art that feeds your soul and might end up being relevant for other people. And of course, the time we all have to devote to reading is different, whether that's our personal time or our work time that you're counting. But however much time or amount that you have, I think in terms of faith formation, work and connections, you get more out of it when you're able to have some sort of system for recording or saving the things that strike you. So for me, I use this website, Tumblr, that I originally started using, back in college just to blog. But since then, I have kind of used to keep quotes from essentially every book I read. I go back and I look at my underlines, and I think, do I want to have this to go back to later? And the thing about Tumblr that I appreciate is you can do tags, so you can go back later and find things. So what I have on the screen right now is my Adam and Eve tag. So there's a poem I put in a week ago about Adam and Eve, but if I click on Adam and Eve, I also then see, oh, here's a quote about Adam and Eve from a book of poetry I read 7 months ago. And so the next slide is the suffering tag. So a poem I read, and I thought, oh, this is about suffering. I'm sure I'm going to talk about suffering at church at some point. So I can look at that tag and see, oh, here's a poem about Job from 4 months ago. Oh, and here's another poem by Ada Limon. And I'm not advocating everyone gets on Tumblr, but I think you can do your own system with a journal, on paper, in a Word document. But I think the key is just to have something you can turn to besides just looking up at your bookshelves, which are filled with things, and finding something that's relevant. Because I think often the poem or art that can work is often something you've already read. And if you're completely wondering, where do I start finding, poetry or literature that might speak to faith or spiritual questions, I cannot speak highly enough of these devotionals by Sarah Arthur. There's one for ordinary time, one for Advent, Light Upon Light, if you're looking for that coming up. And there's one for Lent, Between Midnight and Dawn. And she every week has a number of poems and often an excerpt from a novel that speaks to the themes of the season. And so in general, I think anthologies are really helpful if you're just wanting to know more about what's out there. And that way there will be some poems you dislike and the some you like, and you can explore, the poets that speak to you. You can go seek out more of their work. And I just also compiled a few websites that I can send this slide to people by email if you want. But for visual art, there's this website, artandtheology.org, that I use constantly and look up scripture passages or theological words and can usually find art there. Visual Commentary on Scripture has multiple pieces of art for different passages. And the library at Vanderbilt Div School, they have a database of art in the Christian tradition as well, where you can search by scripture usually, or by term. And there are also websites out there that, specifically gather poetry that they think is helpful for preachers and ministers, like the Journey with Jesus website. In Flesh is kind of a progressive Christian organization that publishes some poetry and blessings. And A Sanctified Art is another kind of Christian organization that they do a lot of visual art resources for congregations, but they also do some poetry for worship as well. So those are just a few starting points, and I will stop screen sharing for now, and I think we move into some discussion.